The Auguste was considered a prisoner ship rented by the British governor of Quebec to carry the defeated military personnel of the French out of Quebec after the surrender of Montreal. Many of them were of the upper class of French-Canadian society, and although it was a prison ship, the people on board carried with them a good deal of money and luxuries. Unfortunately, it was all to end up at the bottom of Aspy Bay, Nova Scotia, along with most of the people on board.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have The Auguste Never Returns to France?
Here we are. Enjoy!
Saint-Luc de la Corne was a man deeply concerned about his future as he embarked on the ship the Auguste. The 7-Year War had changed the landscape for French Canadians, who now found themselves in English-controlled territory with the surrender of Montreal in 1760. The war was not over, but the conditions of surrender of Montreal stating that all French military personnel, including those born in Canada, were to return to France within a year. Saint-Luc de la Corne had stayed for as long as he could. Though many officers left almost as soon as the ink was dry on the surrender, Saint-Luc had remained until the last moment. Part of this might have been due to the sudden indifference that the French government of Paris were now showing to the uprooted officers who suddenly found that they had to rebuild their lives in France. The French government seemed to have decided that now that France no longer had control in Canada, there was no reason to reward the officers who had fought to try to defend it. Worse yet, Saint-Luc had never seen France. He was among the French officers who had been born in Canada as part of the French elite in Quebec. His entire life had been built in French Canada, and now he was being told he had to leave. Saint-Luc might have realized that there was likely to be some hardship in his future, but he had no idea of the magnitude. Many of Canada's citizens were uncertain of what the future would bring, and many of the French occupants did not expect the English to be indulgent towards their identity or culture. No matter what the articles signed at Montreal had stated, the expulsion of the French from Acadia was still fresh in everyone's mind. People such as Saint-Luc and his brother, the Chevalier de la Corne, who had fought for France, had done their best to further their nation's interests, and were knights of the Order of St. Louis sworn to the French king, expected nothing but mistreatment and suspicion from the English who now held Quebec. Saint-Luc was therefore not alone when he arrived in Quebec City to depart for France. With him were many more of the French elite who were fleeing English occupation. He had traveled from Montreal to Quebec City with his brother, 2 of his nephews, and 2 of his sons. Saint-Luc chose not to bring his entire family into exile with him, expecting that the British occupation and his own expulsion would be temporary. Once in Quebec City, there were other well-known figures, including the Chevalier de la Vérendrye, the first European to ever see the Rocky Mountains. This group also made up of much of the most moneyed people in French-Canadian society. For them, being successful military officers certainly did not preclude them from also being successful merchants as well. Saint-Luc was considered possibly the richest man in French Canada, having built a fortune on the fur trade in between military campaigns. With these gentlemen of French-Canadian society were also their extended families. While not all of them brought their families, hoping that they someday would be able to return to Canada, many others feared that they would never be able to see their home soil again, and therefore brought their entire families, as well as the worldly possessions they were permitted by the English government. Many of them carried large sums of money to help them build new lives in France. The terms for allowing the French military officers and other French elites to return to France were in place from the articles signed in Montreal, and General Murray, the English governor of Quebec, followed them scrupulously. When St. Luc and the rest of the remaining French elite arrived, they found 2 ships waiting for them, provided by the English government, perhaps due to the many family members who were traveling with the French military personnel, but it was quickly found that the 2 ships provided, the Jane and the Molyneux, were too small to accommodate all of the people attempting to return to France. St. Luc, as a man of means, approached General Murray and requested permission to hire another ship. General Murray insisted on providing one to them, still determined to do everything in his power to follow the agreements of surrender, as well as to see the French elite no longer on his shores. These were not people he considered to be helping with the smooth transition of British rule. The 3rd ship, the Auguste, was an appropriate ship to offer to the French, who now found England suddenly in control of what had until recently been French territory. The Auguste had originally been a French merchant vessel before being captured by the English in 1756. Sold by the British Navy, it started its new life as a British merchant vessel, with its new owners calling it the Augusta instead of the Auguste. With spaces for 16 guns and at 245 tons, it was well equipped for trade even in turbulent war years, and it had arrived in Quebec as soon as British occupation was known, loaded with all sorts of luxury goods. Now emptied of its goods, the Auguste joined the Jane and the Molyneux as what the British government called cartel ships. Under the terms of agreement, the ships would fly white flags and only bring with them charts of the shores of France to ensure they went where they were intended. Both St. Luc and his brother expressed some concerns about this later point. They approached Governor Murray and requested that they be allowed to hire a pilot to guide them along the coast of Nova Scotia. This Governor Murray would not allow, pointing out that the other 2 ships were not traveling with pilots either, and had expressed no concerns. St. Luc and his brother might have been more cautious than others about the dangers of the sea than the others due to the loss of the 2 of St. Luc's sons who had been on a ship that had been sank by a privateer not many years before. They could not do anything about it once Governor Murray refused, however. Officially, they were now prisoners, even if they were prisoners granted many freedoms. General Murray ordered the ships depart as quickly as possible. He would argue later because of the known storms that plagued the coasts in the fall, but the 3 ships found it difficult to comply. If the concern was that the fall storms would hit soon, the ships would quickly find that they had already arrived. The Auguste, with only half of her full company of sailors and no charts of the coastline, found themselves buffeted by storms worse than the experienced Captain Joseph Knowles swore he had ever seen before. The storms not only caused them to lose their bearings, but they also caused several fires in the ship's galley to start, impeding their ability to prepare the provisions they had stored, those that had not already been lost to the storm. By the time they reached the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the sailors were so exhausted from their constant battle with the storms that they were forced to use some of the French soldiers as watchmen. It did not make much of a difference, since no one knew exactly where they were, and by this time the Auguste was almost entirely unmanageable due to the battering from the storm. What they did know is that they could still see land. Later in the day of November 16th, the Auguste was driven into the sands of Cape Breton Island, near Aspy Bay, during yet more rough weather. It is hard to say how the people who found themselves on the sands of what is now Middle Harbor Beach reached safety. It can only be imagined as a desperate fight against nature, however, since the Auguste was pounded to pieces by the surf in the space of only a few hours once it was driven aground. Once the ship was gone, only 7 people remained out of the 121 people who had originally left Quebec City on board of her. The survivors: Captain Knowles, 2 soldiers, 2 servants, 1 former soldier, and Saint-Luc Delacorne. These men were forced to face the terrible loss and disaster that had just transpired. Saint-Luc had just lost his brother, his nephews, and 2 of his sons. He had also lost all of the things that he had been bringing with him to start his life over. Captain Knowles and Saint-Luc could only guess where they were. They would incorrectly suppose that they were wrecked on Cape Breton. They were not insensitive to the wreckage in front of them, however. After spending a difficult night on the beach as the surf rushed against the beach and the storm raged on, they turned to burying the dead. Only when they finished did they gather what provisions they could and set out to see if they could find the fortress of Louisbourg, which they hoped was close. Saint-Luc Delacorne's skills as a prosperous merchant were of no use along the desolate shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But that had not been what had gotten him exiled from Quebec either. Saint-Luc had led an adventurous life, full of wilderness travel and backwoods life. He was more accustomed than any of the other survivors in living rough and surviving off of the land. At Captain Knowles' request, Saint-Luc was placed in charge of the group. Saint-Luc was not so foolish as to think that this was going to be an easy trip. They had only a guess of where they were and very limited supplies. The people who he was traveling with also had significantly less wilderness experience than he had, and he noted that the soldiers in particular burdened themselves with a lot of things that were not vital provisions, something he thought was foolish. As they hiked, the soldiers slowly shed themselves of these things over the next few days, finding that they did not have the energy to carry them. After 9 days of hard travel, they reached Ingonish, but instead of people to offer them aid, they found only abandoned and empty houses. 2 of their company declared that they could no longer continue the hike. One of the servants had pleurisy, and one of the soldiers decided to remain there due to his exhaustion. Leaving behind their comrades in Ingonish with the promise that they would send them aid, the remaining 5 survivors continued on their way. For the next 7 days, they would continue their march, with Saint-Luc encouraging them as much as possible, even though now there was snow on the ground, making their travel even more difficult. With Saint-Luc's help, they finally arrived at St. Anne's Bay and found a small boat, but all of their hopes of taking it across the bay were dashed when yet another storm blew in. They were close to starvation and ready to give up when 2 natives crossed their path. Saint-Luc was not a stranger to the native populations of Canada. At one point, he said that he spoke 4 or 5 of the native languages, and he served as a formal government interpreter on several important occasions. Saint-Luc was able to explain their plight and ask for assistance, which was quickly granted. The 2 natives took them across the bay in their canoe, and while the rest of the survivors were left seated around a fire eating the last of their provisions, Saint-Luc was brought to the cabin that the natives lived in and provided with not only food for the journey, but also 2 canoes. With the natives now acting as their guides, and with only a 2-day pause due to yet more winter storms, the survivors of the Auguste were brought to St. Peter, an Acadian village. Saint-Luc did have one last humanitarian request for their guides, however, which they agreed to. Saint-Luc asked that the 2 return to Ingonish to see if the 2 people who they had left there were still alive. He doubted they were, but he intended to keep his promise to come back for them. Saint-Luc separated with the rest of the group in St. Peter, with Captain Knowles, the soldier, and the former soldier all heading to Louisbourg to inform them of the wreck. Saint-Luc bluntly informed Captain Knowles that he would not set sail on the sea again. It had taken too much from him. He wanted to be with his remaining family in Montreal, and that meant that he was going to have to avoid the English, who had ordered him to be exiled to France. Saint-Luc chose a very difficult route, and with him he brought the remaining servant and the 2 Acadian guides. A local tribe made his party snowshoes, something that would aid them on their way, as Saint-Luc took them on a path that would lead them hundreds of miles across the snowy wilderness of Canada. The servant was the first to drop off, not up to the rigors of the trip, and remaining behind in a village they'd passed through. In the places that Saint-Luc and the Acadians passed through, the local native tribes already did not have enough food, and they were on the edge of starvation themselves. Saint-Luc could not ask them for aid. Finally, Saint-Luc was forced to send a messenger ahead to ask for supplies from Fort Cumberland, which were provided. Where Saint-Luc traveled, he was met with kindness he had not expected, including from the English officers he considered to be his enemy. A British sergeant that he met at Bay Verde gave him food unsolicited, a fact that Saint-Luc credited with his life since he had been very close to starvation at that point. Once he reached Fort Cumberland, the commander provided him with anything he could desire. A priest took it upon himself to replace the now worn-out snowshoes of his party and provide them with even more food. Saint-Luc was to find that Quebec was a kinder place to him under English rule or not than he had supposed. With this in mind, he turned his steps to Quebec after sending his Acadian guides back home on a sled. 4 months after having bid goodbye to Governor Murray, Saint-Luc stood before him once again, this time to report to complete loss of the vessel of the Auguste, as well as most of the lives on her. Considering his duty done, Saint-Luc returned home to Montreal to announce the devastating news to a city where almost everyone had lost someone in the wreck. Not only was the cost of life terrible, however, the Auguste had taken with her the vast fortunes of many of the more prominent families of what was once called New France. Ignace Gamelin, for example, had given 30,000 livres to his first cousin, and under the 30,000 livres a more distant cousin, hoping that his money would be more secure in France than in the instability of Canada. He had instructed his cousins to not take the same ship to ensure that at least one package would reach France. They did not listen to him, and his 60,000 livres went down with his cousins on the Auguste. The wreck of the Auguste devastated families on both sides of the Atlantic, both personally and financially. This impact quickly cemented the Auguste as one of Canada's most famous shipwrecks, but that did not mean that she was easy to find. Though there was a great interest in her, both historically and for the huge wealth she was known to be carrying, with her having broken quickly into pieces during the storm, and then buried in the sand of the bay, she was not an easy ship to find. It was not until 1977 did the sands shift enough to show pieces of the wreck, allowing the Canadian Park Service archaeologists to begin to analyze the pieces of the terrible disaster that had once happened in Aspy Bay. Almost a third of what was pulled from the sands were coins, making people even more certain that a great fortune lay beneath their feet. Starting in 2001, a group of divers began salvage work under the now repealed Treasure Trove Act, and for the next 3 years they found a great deal of jewelry and coins through dredging the site. It is thought by archaeologists that this work damaged a good deal of what remained to be learned about the wreck of the Auguste. In 2004, an underwater exploration group announced that they believed that they had also found the stern of the Auguste in as scattered condition as the bow. By the time that the archaeologists of the Park Service returned in 2005, the most significant items still remaining where they had originally lain were 3 of the ship's cannons. Though Saint-Luc walked such a great distance to escape the Auguste and the terrible death that surrounded her, his name will always be tied to the ship. He wrote about his experiences, an account that was later published, and it has given us the most details about the terrible wreck. The wreck of the Auguste would also shape his future. He had once had 7 children, but with the sinking of the Auguste, he no longer had any sons remaining. He and his 3 daughters remained in Montreal, and after a time even resigned themselves to the idea that the English were to remain in control of Quebec. Saint-Luc no longer had the heart to travel the ocean, and the British government, terms of surrender or not, seemed content to allow the bereaved father to remain in his home with his remaining family. For more information about the items found on the Auguste, as well as more about Saint-Luc's trek across hundreds of miles on foot, please see The Wreck of the Auguste, published by the National Historic Sites Park Service of Canada. For more information about the changing world Saint-Luc de la Corne found himself in, please see our sources below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.